I'm not sure why consumers even buy these. You simply have no idea how many times I find these sitting on the curb being given away for free. So is there a point even getting one of these? And the bigger question is, at least for me, is it even worth my time to pick up and fix? Otherwise, after putting my time and more importantly my money into it, I could be the one who gets stuck with something that apparently no one wants to use. In today's video, we're going to be looking at this Troy-Bilt branded edger, and the problem is that I just picked it up and I'm not even sure that it even works. Now there is one saving grace for this edger, and that's the engine that's on it, but we'll get more into that here in a bit. Now I am going to try and repair this edger, but yours might be a little different, so this might not work on yours. So if things are not working out for you, like in the video, please ask about it and I'll be glad to answer your questions. Now for some background information, I was able to find this edger by using one of my favorite apps where people post items they want to get rid of. Now like I mentioned earlier, this engine is very special, and for those of you who don't know why, let me explain it then. Now on this particular style of fuel system, the carb sits on top of the fuel tank. That means the carb has a built-in diaphragm pump to pull the gasoline to a higher location that the carb could then use to deliver fuel to the engine. What that means is if the gasoline goes bad, it won't affect the main body of the carb. That way the carb won't be damaged to neglect, unlike other systems where gravity helps feed the fuel to the carb. Now by the looks of the oil, either the edger hasn't been used all that much or the oil was recently changed because it's not really that dirty. However, the oil level is a bit too high, which is not ideal, but I'd rather take it a bit overfilled than under. The only thing left to do is to prime the engine and then try starting it. Now, unfortunately, it didn't start, but the other item that's a bit awkward is the pull rope. It seems to be about a foot too short, and that's even with my little arms. Now, since it didn't start by using the primer, I'm going to remove the air filter and then physically prime the engine instead. Now, with the filter out of the way and pressing the bulb a couple of times, I don't see any fuel being sprayed, so it makes sense why the engine didn't start. So luckily this time it started and sputtered to life. However, it wasn't a very promising sputter. Now either way, since we know that it does run, it confirms that we have enough compression from the engine and that we also have a working ignition system. Also, since I know the engine works and more than likely we'll just need to clean out all that old gasoline to get it working again, I want to get it cleaned up, that way it'll be ready for sale as soon as we get it running again. Now, if you've seen any of my other videos when dealing with engines like this one, the turnaround time after getting it in and out of the door is quite short. That's the reason why I really like this style of engine and carb. They're just so simple and easy to make money on. Of course, it does help if the machine is not missing any parts, otherwise you'll have to replace those parts to make it functional again, which will cut into the money you could make on it. Not a big deal if it was free, but it could be a concern if it wasn't. So it's lucky for us then that this one was complete, and unless I need to replace a maintenance item like an air filter, a spark plug, or the diaphragm, we shouldn't have any problems making a good profit on it. Now this does bring up a very sobering fact. This machine right now costs a staggering $400 to replace, and yet I was able to pick this one up for free. Why would someone give away this much money instead of selling it themselves? Of course, I can only make a guess as to the reason why, but the most likely reason would be that they felt the cost to fix it would offset any money gained by its sale. They must have got it out of the shed and tried to use it, but it didn't start just like it did for us, and they simply didn't want to mess with it and posted the ad giving it away. Of course, that's not the only reason why they would have given it away, but to me it makes a lot of sense, and you're welcome to disagree with me. After getting down to the engine and cleaning off all the dirt that could potentially get in the way of it cooling itself, we'll just let it dry off now. And when most of the water is finally evaporated and gone, we'll start the process of trying to figure out why the engine didn't start. Now, as you can tell, this edger was not used all that much because aside from a single rust spot on one of the wheels, this machine is almost in perfect condition. Now, it's kind of difficult to believe that someone would buy something like this and use it only a handful of times only to let it set after that. Now, we know that it does have gasoline in the tank, but we don't have an idea of what kind of condition it's in. And as you can see, after getting a flashlight closer to it, there seems to be enough gasoline in the fuel tank. However, we take a look at it from a different angle, you can see the pickup tube, but the gasoline is barely touching it. That means the carb may not have been able to draw any gasoline from the tank to get it up to the carb. The next thing that I want to do is to drain out all the old gasoline from the tank and examine it to see if it's the reason why it wouldn't start. So right off the bat, it would appear that there was barely any gasoline in the fuel tank, which now makes sense why the engine didn't start. Now the other reason why is because what little gasoline was in there also looks to be about 3 years old, which if it wasn't stabilized would be impossible to use. Now because I'm only using a gravity siphon to drain out the tank, I'm not able to get all of it out. That means I'm going to have to use some paper towels to wick up the last bit of the gasoline, which works surprisingly well. Now I did notice that the air filter looked a bit dirty when I took it off earlier, so I'm going to get a better look at it and see if we can reuse it. So it's obviously still wet from the cleaning, but it seems like we should be able to just clean off the dirt. However, once you realize that the exposed parts of the foam filter are actually breaking apart, it kind of changes our plans. Now, even though in a pinch we could simply remove the bad parts of the filter so that we can reuse it, it doesn't look very good when you go to try to resell the edger, so it's best that we just replace it instead. So unfortunately, we found our first item that we'll need to replace, but just because we have to replace it doesn't mean it has to cut deep into the profits. I'll explain more on that here in a bit. Now speaking of cutting into the profits, there was also another item that was going to do that anyway, and I showed it to you while we were trying to start the engine. If you recall, when I was trying to pull the rope seemed to be about a foot too short. Now this might not seem like a big deal to you, but for me, a short pull rope could make for a frustrating experience when trying to start an edger. Fortunately, replacing the rope on a recoil where the rope is not broken is fairly easy to do. All you have to do is pull the rope all the way out of the recoil and then jam the pulley using whatever method works best for you. Then simply pull out the tight end of the rope, cut off the knot, and then take out the rope from the pulley. Now the new pull rope I'm going to use is pretty much the same size as the one I just took off. Just be careful that you don't get one that's a lot thicker than the old one. Now the reason why is because the pulley can only wind up so much rope, and if the rope is a lot thicker than the original one, it might not have enough room for all of it. Now of course, this would be a great time to replace a broken pull handle, but luckily this one is in really good shape, so at least we don't have to spend any money on a new one. Now after getting the handle taken care of, all we have to do now is insert the other end of the rope into the pulley and make a knot, and then carefully release the pulley and let the rope wind up. Of course, if you wanted to add another couple of turns to the recoil spring, now would be a great time to do it. However, just be very careful and don't get too greedy, because if you put too many turns on the spring, it could end up binding up on you, or worse yet, end up breaking when you go to pull on the rope. Now some like to put enough turns on the recoil spring so that the handle ends up against the recoil. However, since the handle is meant to rest against the upper part of the handlebar, I like to leave about a foot of rope exposed instead. Now while I have easy access, I'm going to spray some lube on the moving parts of the flywheel brake and the kill switch. Of course, spraying a bit of lube on the brake cable wouldn't hurt either. Now over time, these parts can get very stiff and end up causing the brake handle to be very difficult to use, so a bit of lube will help out a lot. So at this point, I'm ready to start putting the engine back together, but we still have one more item we need to take care of, and that's the engine oil. If you recall, the oil level was about a ½ inch above the full mark, which doesn't sound like a bad deal, but it is. Now when dealing with a small engine like this one, oiling is done by mostly splashing oil to get it where it needs to go, and these systems are very sensitive to, you guessed it, the oil's level. So if the oil level is low, less oil will be splashed around, so you might be guessing that more oil would be the answer to a problem like this. Unfortunately, that's not the case. If the oil is too high, the oil slinger might end up making the oil turn into a frothy mess of air and oil instead of an oily mist. And even though too much oil is better than not enough oil, it's still not an ideal case to have too much. Now I'm not going to pour out all the oil. Instead, I'm just going to pour out some of the extra oil so that the oil level is as close to the full mark as possible. Now, I'll be the first to admit it, but reading the dipstick is very tough to do when the oil is clean. But take your time and read it as many times as you need to, and I would also check it after running the engine the next time. So after putting some gasoline into the fuel tank, I'll then press the primer bulb a couple of times just to make sure that it works, and as you can see, it seems to be working like it should be. But before we try and start the engine, I need to apply some oil to the new foam filter and install it into the airbox. Now instead of getting some OEM air filters, you can get some aftermarket ones for a very fair price. However, if you do buy them in a multi-pack, each filter could be as little as $1 a piece. Now what would I do if the primer bulb was not working to spray any fuel into the engine though? Now if that does happen, I would take the carb off the fuel tank and clean the screen on the pickup tube with carb cleaner. But if that doesn't work out, then I might consider replacing the primer bulb, as it might be cracked and not able to help draw any fuel from the tank. So this time the engine started and it sounded pretty good. It did take 3 pulls to get it to start, but that's because it had to fill the fuel bowl first. But now that the fuel bowl is full, it should start with fewer pulls. Also, I have to wonder if it'll start while the engine is a bit warm. So as you just saw, since the fuel bowl was full, it started on the first pull, so I'm very confident that this engine is going to work very well. Now, I don't typically have any issues when selling mowers that have these engines on it, but edgers are a bit different. The reason being, these are not as popular as mowers because most people do their edging with a string trimmer instead. However, there are those out there that like the way these perform over using a string trimmer. Unfortunately, those customers are just harder to find. Now these little engines with the carbs on top of the fuel tanks are tough to beat. All you have to do is either keep the gasoline fresh or use a fuel stabilizer to help out. And besides keeping the oil topped off, these things should keep running a lot longer than any mower will. So are these big edgers a good deal? Well, I don't know the answer to that, but all I know is when I find these, I always make money on them, and after seeing this video, hopefully you understand why. So my question is, would you buy one of these monster edgers to edge with, or is your string trimmer a better option? Now to be honest, I like these, however, I just find these a little bit too cumbersome to use. Thank you for watching. I really do appreciate your time here. Please feel free to ask me any questions about this project or about your own projects, and I hope to see you in the next video.